as well.
Yeah, Jamie requested for us to record it so she can go back and watch it.
Okay. All right. Now that
Come
we're
on,
recording.
Phil.
Sorry. Now that we're recording. Okay. Now we're recording. This is officially the Think Before You Drink number 2 about overhead injuries. We were just talking about injury prevention programs. So there's a study that came out about youth baseball players doing a prevention program for medial elbow injuries called the YKB-9, which is also called the Yokohama Baseball 9 program. It consists of 9 stretches and 9 strengthening exercises. So so seeing how special they are, they're it looks through pretty much like the whole body. There's all 9 exercises and stretches go to pretty much every region of the body. So for the 9 stretches, you start off with a brachial muscle massage, and then you go into a pronator muscle stretch, and then a tricep stretch, and then you do a cross arm stretch, and then your sleeper stretch, and then you have more of like a lower thorax mobility
Isn't that this one?
drill.
That rotational
So
one?
this one, so this one is you're kind of just you're in a hook lying position, and then you're swinging your knees back and from side to side. So they're trying to get more of that that thoracolumbar region.
Yep.
And then you have a trunk rotation stretch. That's just more of like you're switching your hips, and then you reach for the other side. Then you get a posterior hip stretch, so that's like close to a child's pose, and then you have your hip flexor stretch. So that's your 9 stretches. Now your 9 strengthening exercises, you're going into your rotator cuff muscle. So you go with your supraspinatus. They ask you to take your baseball glove, and then you're going into scaption, and you're abducting it to 60 degrees. So you do that on your dominant, your throwing arm. You do that for 20 times. And then your subscapularis strengthening exercises, you're pretty much doing you're laying supine, and then you have your arm at 90 degrees, and then you're going to internal rotation. And then you have your teres minor. You're laying supine, you're laying prone, and then I'm trying to look at the picture here, but let's see if I could. Oh, nope, that does not show. Anyway, you're laying prone, and you're going into external rotation, and you're lifting it from the floor. Your trap exercises, that's like your Ys. And then you do a push-up plus, and then you have your cat camel, your upper back rounding exercise, and then you have a trunk rotation exercise, and then you're doing a lateral slide exercise, which is like your single leg balance, and then you try to reach laterally. So it's kind of like doing like a single leg balance with a reach. And then you do a elbow to knee exercise, which is you're in your pitching stance, and then you're bringing your elbow to your knee. So whichever knee is in front, it's kind of in a flexed position, and then you're bringing the contralateral elbow down to your knee. So it has that rotation of the hip. So those are your 9 strengthening exercises. And what they found is that comparing the...
You guys have the article up right now? Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. What they saw is that they had, after a year follow-up, they look at the injuries, and it looks like that the intervention group had 50% less, close to 50% injuries less than the control group. And then they also had some biomechanical measures too, from what I see. So even with the control group, what I thought was pretty interesting was that, if you look at there's figure 5. If you look on page 466 on the journal article, they show a lot of the different graphs about like total rotation of the shoulder, hip internal rotation, strength of lower trap, and then thoracic kyphosis angle. I think what was really cool is that the intervention group, all those variables stayed consistent throughout the whole entire year from baseline to the end of the period, while the control group, you see like a huge change, as in you see like a huge decrease in total rotation of the shoulder with the control group. There's less hip internal rotation, and then you'll see like a smaller dip in the lower trap strength, and then thoracic kyphosis angle increases from baseline to the end of the year. So I think it just proves that there needs to be some sort of in-season conditioning too, to maintain those. And then I think that there is a positive correlation with the intervention and injury incidence rate. So yeah. So I thought that was cool. And then I think I was supposed to look up the pitch count, and I think what was interesting, there was a good review done by Heath Malugan and Nels Leafblad, Chris Camp, and Stan Conti. So he pretty much breaks it down by level of baseball. So they talk about youth.
Here.
Yeah. Yep. So that article right there. So they talk about youth, high school, college, and pros. In the youth part, I highlighted. I thought this part was like a really good highlight. So it says, for example, in a survey of 98 youth baseball players ages 4 to 16, 63% of respondents disagreed with the statement, "The more you throw, the more likely you are to get an injury." A majority of respondents also reported that they would continue playing if they experienced an injury or had a sore arm during a game. So I think it just kind of shows that like the youth kids, they're in that kind of mindset that like kind of like play through the pain per se. And it's just, even no matter if we like put a pitch count and we try to regulate it as much, and it's just, it really takes that communication between the parents, coaches, and the kid to make sure that the kid's safety and well-being is prioritized. Because even the kids don't know much better. It's like, oh, my arm feels sore, but what exactly is sore? Like, does that really play a huge role in like clinical decision making, things like that. And then I was thinking about this too, but it's like, even if we did regulate a pitch count, it doesn't change the fact that there's so many baseball players out there that will play during the off season anyway. And so I think even if we had the pitch count regulated, I think the factor that matters a lot too is just the athletic exposures. And if we have a high athletic exposure, then chances of seeing that injury rate, it's most likely going to increase if we keep exposing them into that same setting. So yeah, I think it's just like, it's just, to me, it just seems a little ironic that like we always emphasize on pitch count, but it doesn't change the fact that it doesn't change the minds of parents saying like, oh, like, I still need to get my kid up a level and try to get them into the pros. Like, this is promising. We need to enroll them onto like travel ball and things like that. And that's just continually exposing them to the pitch count or just putting them in that position, like in that 8-month span that they recommend. So I don't know. Those are just my thoughts from reading the articles.
Yeah, I think they kind of mentioned something in that Stan Conti's article that I think is pretty prevalent especially in Little League baseball to travel ball, is the what the parents are being told is if their kids do not participate in these particular leagues, they will get left behind. So they will not be able to keep up with their age-related peers if they do not participate in the sport all the way around. Now, I think there is something to that. When these kids do play a sport year-round, I do think they are becoming better skilled baseball players. They throw harder, they catch better, they can hit well, but they may not be better athletes, right? So I think that's kind of where, until the mindset of the coaches and the parents start to change, there's going to be a continual emphasis towards that overuse, I think is really kind of what it comes down to. And kind of like that article that I pointed out last time in our in that the youth throwing one, was it most coaches know the pitch counts, or they don't really care about them, right? Because they kind of blow through it, they ignore it. So and I think the other part too, I think this was at the very end of that article, the Connie article, was it said something with the emphasis of so much towards making money, right? So the key is that there's this allure that they're going to make the professional level, and they're going to make money and get a scholarship and then go on to play Major League Baseball. Is a little bit unfortunate, but and Stan's really, really sharp guy when it comes to this stuff. So he's basically kind of given up a lot of his clinical practice to do the epidemiology of injuries and stuff like that. So, but pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, and then I do want to mention too, there's another part of the article that kind of stuck out to me was coaches should avoid the use of radar guns when possible, particularly in practices, as this may be correlated with increased risk of injury. And then it kind of brought me back to Willow Glen. There was actually one of the vice principal's daughters on a travel softball team, and they were doing a bunch of showcases, and yeah, they mentioned to me, oh yeah, like she was in the showcase, the coaches out there had a radar gun, and they were just trying to measure they were trying to measure her pit or her throw velocity, and I thought that was just crazy. And then and I think just those kinds of like tools just really gives that false sense of like, oh well, if I don't pitch fast enough, then I'm not going to be scouted or recruited as an athlete. And I think that just gives that false sense. But what kind of struck to me too was that if the parents knew about it, why didn't they say something? Like if it's like, okay, they would question themselves, like, why is there a radar gun there? And I know they're going to try to make my child peak during their pitching or throwing velocity. And I know that's bad, but why didn't I intervene for that? And part of it is just, yeah. And I feel like just part of it's like, well, one, it's like, do I want to get in the way of an opportunity that might give my child like a scholarship opportunity or an opportunity to play at a higher level? Like, do I want to get in the way of that? Or maybe it might not cause an injury, something like that. But I don't know. It was just like, it kind of made me recall that distinct memory. Like, there was a showcase and they have these radar guns and they want to like put measurables to things. And then this article mentioned like coaches should not use a radar gun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. Definitely. Did you guys get the other stuff too on the, so I'll pick up where Dexter was supposed to go. But Phil, I think it perfectly leads into the segue. So I was able to track down Mike Reinold's kind of PowerPoint from a couple of years ago at the Giants talk. I don't know, Jendo, were you at that one?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think what I kind of get out of that is it's pretty important to kind of go back and think about really kind of what the emphasis is for these kids, right? I think that's kind of one of those things that the parents kind of get so excited about. Oh my gosh, I want my kid to be the best. But they kind of miss out on the big picture. And so there's the sexy thing, and the sexy thing is velocity, right? So I'll just kind of go through, his talk, and I think it really kind of makes sense as to really why this has kind of gone the way it has. And so basically here's the talk. And so it's basically going back to the concept that there was a big change in everything came down to pitching and velocity, right? And so as you can see through the bottom, that the left-hand slide is, 2007 to 2015, you just see this gradual increase in velocity over time. So all these pitchers are throwing harder, they're throwing faster. So people are really seeing that as that's the golden ticket, right? So basically everyone's coming out of this thinking, if I could just throw harder, the scouts will look at you, right? Which is exactly what Phil was just saying. So, when you start thinking about that, is it really the concept? Is it the scouts? Is it the scouting that's really driving this? And I think that, we're starting to look at the average velocity for most of these guys. They're throwing in the low 90s, which is pretty damn good. Some of the guys are getting higher than that, but that's the average. So where Stan Connie with that article comes in is he really kind of left baseball in that time of the injury era where we really started to see injuries peak. And that was kind of that, Dr. Andrews wrote the book, Any Given Sunday. Stan was kind of seeing a lot of this, was seeing a heck of a lot more of the UCLs and slap tears and all this other stuff. So basically all these injuries were kind of just peaking and just getting out of control. And we were starting to see them occurring in younger age kids. So kind of here, just kind of that data was, between, 05, 08, 37% injury increase. You're looking at 10 times increase in kids and, 193% in UCLs in New York State. I mean, it's just kind of crazy that what we're starting to see, and kind of went back to showing you guys last time was the avulsion fractures from the little league elbows and things like that we saw from, some of the kids we were seeing here. I really remember starting to see that happen in about 2006. And that's kind of ironic because that's when you start to say, is that the injury era? Because here it's 2005. So the reason I remember that was because at that time in Los Gatos, there was a new doctor, Dr. Deborah Popejoy. She was a pediatric orthopedic surgeon, and now she's up at the Shriners Hospital in Sacramento. And she was here in the area, and she was just like, sending us tons of kids. And we went from, the average age of the kids that we were seeing was, 18 to 22. And all of a sudden we started seeing 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old kids. And the arm injuries just got completely out of control. So I would agree that this is probably that time. So Mike kind of proposes, why is that increase? Well, it's the radar guns. I mean, here's a picture at a what they call a showcase where kids go and they start just doing different drills. They aren't really playing baseball. They're just throwing the ball, catching the ball, or hitting the ball. And these guys are all sitting in stands just shooting their radar guns to get the guys with the highest velocity. So, when you start looking at that, is there a correlation between elbow stress and velocity? Absolutely, right? So we're seeing that those two things go hand in hand. So what is the reason for injury? Everyone used to think it was the curveball. Everyone used to think it was, throwing the curve too early, too young, that kind of stuff. But there really is the one thing that continues to correlate to it, and it's just how much they throw, right? So what we do know is that throwing, just the mechanics of the throwing, this high stress to the elbow, especially the elbow more so than the shoulder, it's just there's a lot of stress there that is, especially at younger ages, they're just not able to tolerate if they overthrow or throw too much. So that goes back to those recommendations. If people are, one, not listening to the recommendations, or two, just kind of looking at it like, oh, well, this is the only way they're going to get better, right? So that's the thing that kind of sucks about it. But when you start thinking about it, that's the kind of stress that goes through the arm. It's like throwing a 300-pound dumbbell when they're throwing. So, but it's not just the overuse, and it's, it's kind of, you got to start looking at the whole equation of how much of it is the intensity, quantity, as well as the overuse. We start looking at that, that goes into the training programs. So kind of going into the, the stuff Japanese were doing, looking at, is there things that we can do to help kind of train them to improve their performance, but also to decrease their injury rate. And one of those things that you start looking at, and this is why the injury rate really started to pick up, especially in the younger kids, was velocity was kind of being marketed as throwing weighted balls. And that's the driveline companies, those types of things are really kind of emphasizing this is how you throw. So it was kind of the next big thing, right? So they were selling it to the parents of, if you want to get noticed, you got to throw harder. This is a fast way to get better. Okay. So, it's easy. People can sell that. If you can throw harder and throw faster, people will buy it. But if you say, oh, well, I want to, prevent injury, they kind of look at you a little sideways. They don't really care about that stuff. So the problem with that right now is that most of those programs, they're year round. Okay. The performance enhancement can't solely be focused on throwing. And that's kind of the whole thing where he talks in. The reason why I wanted to find this talk was because, I think we already kind of know this information, but I like the way he describes the concepts of how to break down the performance into different buckets of what we're trying to look at. So it can't be just on throwing. So, the whole thing of increasing velocity, there's all kinds of different ways to do it, but you kind of have to think about what the risk versus reward is. And one of the most valuable things I've learned in sports is it really comes down to risk reward. There are things that you might do treating a professional athlete that you may not do with your 40-year-old weekend warrior. Why? The risk versus reward. Their risk of whatever they need to do, that particular activity might have a higher risk, but the reward is higher for them. Where if you do that with a 40-year-old, the risk of making them worse for what? To play in a beer league softball game, there's very little reward, right? So you have to kind of consider those things. Uh-oh. Are we going to get booted on that, Phil? On a 40-minute limit? No? Phil?
I think he just upgraded it, so we should be good. I don't know where he went, but
Okay. Got it. So I think that's the whole thing of kind of going back to kind of preventing the injuries, enhance the performance. I think, obviously what Mike's saying here is the popular things are not always the best, right? So a lot of the stuff that's popular is on Instagram. And I think one of the worst places you can do about learning stuff is Instagram. But I know that a lot of younger therapists, that's where they go. And I don't think that's really where they should be going. So when we start getting into the safe ways to increase velocity, reduce injuries, this is their full potential as an athlete, right? But we got to break those up into different buckets, okay? So as a professional athlete, they work on strength, arm care, throwing mechanics, and they also have the benefit of age and maturity. When it comes to a younger athlete, they kind of have to break those up a little bit differently, but you can see how they spend their time. They spend a lot of that time, not a lot of time, period, right? So they're really kind of squishing all this in here when they really should be maximizing all of those four components. So those are the four buckets: strengthening, arm care, throwing mechanics, age and maturity. And if you start thinking of it in that term, you'll start kind of getting a better grasp of when to do these different things at what time of year. So when you start thinking that is, kind of right in the beginning of the season is really when you're going to be doing a lot more of the throwing and emphasis on the mechanics. You may not be doing some of the arm care, and you might be doing some strength, but it's not as much. When you really start looking at how you balance that out, this is kind of, I think, more the true. You do want to have strength, you do want to have arm care, you want to having the throwing mechanics, but the age and maturity kind of starts to play a little bit less of a factor as they get older. Basically, I think what he meant by this was you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? You do have to take some and trade some things off here. And so in order to reach that full potential, there's these ratios that we have to kind of play with. So as we get to age and maturity, there's a huge variation in skeletal maturity. And I think I remember seeing this. My son, playing baseball was always one of the smaller kids. Flat out. He was just smaller. He was little. And then there would always be that 12-year-old freak that looks like a man and he's shaving, right? And those kids are always picked and they're pitching, because that's just the way it is. But they're all 12. And you're like, well, how's that kid already, hitting puberty, and this other kid is like, has a high voice and doesn't even know what a girl is, right? So you get this huge variation at that age. The thing we are starting to see is there are two very predictive variables for velocity, and that is age and height, right? So here, according to, I don't know how you even say this name, Segori, they were saying that for every year of age from 11 to 19, they're going to gain 1.5 miles per hour in velocity just by getting older. Okay, so that's skeletal maturity. For every inch, they're going to gain 1.2 miles per hour. So, and that's between kind of that, I think it was like what, I can't even know math, right? 72 is going to be 6'2", right? So yeah, so basically, how tall is that? That's pretty short, right? Right here,
Yeah, that's pretty short.
60 inches, dude, that's really short. Yeah, dang. So basically, it shows that if you're short, you don't throw hard, right? So I think it's surprising when you do see a little kid that does throw hard, but basically you're going to see that every time. So that's why you're seeing the size of pitchers is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And they're scouting for that. They're looking for the big guys, the longer lever arms and things like that. So here you go. If you get a typical 16-year-old's going to grow 3 inches in 1 year, you're looking at about a 5-mile increase. Okay, so a lot of these kids are freaking out. They need to get this velocity at 10 or 12 years old. Let them grow up, let them mature, and let them develop. It's as simple as that. Testosterone is an amazing thing for velocity. So, I think that's one of the things we're going to have to look at. So, but also, has that throwing arm develop? Well, that's the thing we're starting to see, and that was that whole external rotation gain, and little bit of that loss of internal rotation is that humeral retroversion. So it's basically, if you think of that, it's like torquing a towel, trying to wring out the water out of it. It's kind of in that layback, it's kind of stretching and kind of twisting it into that external rotation. So this is kind of that whole concept. So that picture that we showed the other day was essentially used from Mike and D. Nichols, but Mike's the one that's kind of used it the most in most of his publications. But this is that concept of the total arc. And with a thrower, it's going to be just shifted a little bit more posteriorly than with a non-thrower. They're going to have a little bit kind of more external rotation or layback. So Wolff's law is basically that all this stuff adapts to the stresses that are put on it. So if it's always in that layback position at a high velocity, it's going to get a low load, long duration force that changes the principles of essentially the bone and the connective tissues and gain that external rotation gain. So what do? So his recommendation was they should still play catch a lot, which is essentially that frequent low load stress, where you don't have a very high risk, but you've got a big high reward. Okay, so here, same kind of thing. It's more dependent on their age and maturity of what their full potential is. So you can't predict it at that age yet. What eventually kind of goes into that throwing arm is that kind of goes into that arm care, right? So what happens? So as someone throws, they naturally get a little bit stiffer and a little bit tighter, especially on the posterior shoulder. That's where the arm care comes into play. And that's where essentially that concept of throwing is bad for you. We do know there's an immediate loss of internal range motion and cross-body range motion after throwing, a loss of cuff strength, and a cumulative loss of strength and range of motion as well. So when we start looking at that, this is kind of where essentially Mike would kind of coin that term of tight and tired. You look at their elevation on their throwing side, and you're going to see a little bit less elevation. So a lot of the soft tissue is dependent right in through here or in the posterior shoulder. So some easy ways to gain that velocity is to optimize the body, which is kind of restore some of that range of motion, restore some of that soft tissue mobility. A lot of it's going to be on the posterior cuff, down in through the lat and into the middle trap, and also the lower trap. So basically, the program also focuses on strength and dynamic stabilization, which is the side external rotation, you name it, all that stuff, the perturbations for stability, et cetera, et cetera. And so basically he's saying that it's not just the weighted ball type concepts that are kind of increasing strength. So all of these different things have been proven. So Raphael's done tons of research on just looking at dumbbells and bands will still increase rotator cuff strength or velocity as well. So those you could still do quite a bit during the season. You just may not do it quite as intense or as frequent as you might in the off season. So going back to that, you need the progressive resistance. Tubing generally isn't enough for the weakness. You need to go after that with free weight type things or kind of Kaiser type equipment or even the impulse inertial trainer. So, but there needs to be that combination of the strength and dynamic stability. And don't work that cuff to failure. I mean, I think that's probably one of the biggest things is you just don't want to kill them so badly that they can't even move their arm. That's one of the things that you have to be a little bit careful with the impulse trainer, because it can work them to failure. And so that's one of the things I always kind of keep in the back of my mind. So this is a picture of the guy prone, doing a little dumbbell, going an external rotation, abduction, 90 degrees. Bands, plyos, you name it. So in his terms, what to do for that arm care is a lot of the manual therapy to maintain the soft tissue mobility, progressive resistance, arm care program or strengthening, incorporate that dynamic stability, and don't really kind of poop them out too badly. So there's low risk and high reward. So that's your arm care bucket, right? So when you start getting into just pure strength, the stronger, the more resilient, and also more effective. What we're seeing here is strength and velocity. Yes, you're going to see a huge improvement with, again, medicine balls, those kinds of things, core stability. Everything is going to be kind of helpful. But his take of that is it needs to be the right program for that particular player. So the right, the wrong, the better. I think it's pretty well documented. You're just not going to see a lot of baseball players doing snatches or cleans. And part of that is just because of the stress on the elbow and also the stress of the shoulders at end ranges. So most people, you're just not going to see strength coaches at the baseball level doing a lot of these types of lifts. They may modify them a little bit, but they probably won't have them do that. But what he kind of recommends is more that speed and load at the end range motion. So kettlebell hip swings, hex bar deadlifts, sled pushes, things like that, as well as throws. So kind of plyo ball throws against the wall, things like that. And it's kind of integrating everything. Also kind of some of the Smith racks or the hex bar is sometimes taking the weight down and having them doing jumps and plyo to get that explosive power. Integrating the whole thing is kind of thinking everything's kind of built on top of each other as they stack the rocks. Pretty important to kind of think of everything there, and then kind of going from that top or bottom to top, thinking of the ground reaction forces that they have to generate in order to be able to throw the ball hard. Again, and then second, kind of that linear force forward, and also in that late cocking phase, which most people are really where they start to report a lot of their shoulder problems. They don't have to look huge, I think is one of the big things. This is, one of his slides was all about, can you pick out the all league pitcher, the guy who was the all-star and, had the most World Series wins out of these three guys. And, so who was paid the most, who had the most innings pitched, who was an 11-time all-star, who had pitched in 8 World Series, 2 no-hitters, you would never be able to guess. But when you start to think of it, I think it was this dude, if I'm not mistaken. And so it's not necessarily the guys that are big and buffed. It's just what fits for those particular dudes. A lot of these guys do not look great, but they are strong or they are in pretty good shape, but they just don't look it. So do we want to get them to all look like this dude? No, I don't think so. But that 100 mile an hour, the diminishing return is, especially going after that fitness level, those things are really kind of the things we really, I don't know if there's a huge trade-off that we want to go after for the risk versus the reward on that. His big thing, which I would agree with this, is what you're starting to see a little bit more is that thoracic outlet in these throwers. Part of it's because of that position of the abduction, external rotation, and that kind of layback, which puts a huge stress on the brachial plexus and the neurovascular bundle under the clavicle and through the scalenes. When he started kind of saying that, he used these pictures where you really do see this huge kind of atrophy of the SCM, where on the non-dominant side, it's not really there. So this is a particular pitcher who did have the first rib resection and the TOS surgery. I've seen a couple of them. I definitely think that if they do exhibit those signs, it's not classic. It's not your typical numbness, tingling, or cold hand or things like that. It may just be they continually have arm pain, right? And that arm pain could be at the shoulder, it could be at the elbow, it could be anywhere. So I think that's kind of one of the difficult things to be able to kind of assess. And you need to be on with guys that are really looking at understanding how to do that first rib resection and then also getting these guys back to throw. So really the big question is what to do, get them back in the gym, develop appropriate strength, and gain linear and rotational power. Yes, there's going to be a medium risk, but the reward is high. So I think that's kind of one of those things that, again, just keeping in mind, that's the bucket you want to be able to fill. And I think that is the off-season time to do that, not necessarily in season. The arm care and the throwing mechanics are going to be your in season. This is something that's not going to affect what time of year it is. But I think for this younger group, we need to really emphasize getting them on a strength program, but also to just take time off. So the other two components, the throwing mechanics, again, most efficient mechanics, it creates the best velocity. I think we know which stresses are causing those things and which also contribute to velocity. But I think one of the things that you got to remember is that people throw different. And I think if we try and put everyone into the same bucket of what they should look like and how they should throw, what arm slot they should be, what angle their elbow should be, I think we're kind of missing the boat. There's some dudes that are just super efficient regardless of what arm slot they have. So it's not always necessarily that we're going to change that, especially when they get to the big league level. Again, biomechanics of velocity, there's the biggest things that we got to kind of consider in terms of the hip separation, stride length, the glove side forward trunk lean, as well as that whole concept of how far it does look like he's really far over, but if you really kind of tilt him back up, he's right at 90 degrees in terms of his arm strength or arm position or arm slot. Take-home message from that is really, if it was much more emphasized on these things than velocity for these kids, they would probably be a lot better off. So if we were really working on their mechanics as opposed to just velocity, they'd be doing much better. Training programs, the science of kind of throwing long toss. I think we do know that there's huge stresses on the arm, kind of starting at that 180 feet. Dr. Akazuki, who we work with quite a bit with San Jose State and the San Francisco Giants, he kind of advocates to not ever get to 180 feet. So he kind of nixes that part of the interval throwing program. Again, also, there is going to be some of that changing in mechanics when people really start throwing really hard. So I think we got to consider those things when we start going there. The science of the weighted balls, kind of going back to this, if you start thinking of the stresses that kind of goes on to it, this is kind of where I think where people were starting to kind of buy into this whole concept of the weighted balls. They definitely increase the volume or velocity. The balls are pretty small. We actually have the weighted balls here, but it's both kind of having that over and underloading effect. It's kind of like throwing a tennis ball. That sometimes people hurt really bad when they throw a tennis ball, but they throw something heavier and they feel a little bit better. That was kind of that concept behind that. In sports health, they kind of did look at this biomechanically. The underload had a significant increase in stress, and the overload of weighted balls decreased that stress. So what is that peak stress? And I think that's where companies like Driveline kind of took this to the bank and started saying, well, if you overload them with a heavier ball, you're going to decrease the stress. So then they really said, this is why, heavier balls makes you throw better, yada, yada, yada. The problem with that is you start seeing right here that peak with the 4-ounce ball. And so what we're trying to figure out is it does effective enhancing velocity, but we don't know exactly what the ideal dosage is. And that's kind of the bottom line, is how much should we really be doing this? I think what we do know through a lot of this stuff, looking at the metrics and things like that, is we don't want to do it in young kids. So this was a study that Mike and his group had done. It was a 6-week program, gradual progression from kneeling, rocking to a gun, using different weighted balls. Obviously, they all improved in their velocity. I think obviously it says it here, 85%. There was no difference in the control group, no difference in the valgus stress of the angular group, right? However, when you started looking over the season, the weighted ball group had 27% more injuries, okay? And there were no injuries in the control group. So when you start looking at the dominant total range of motion, there also was an increase in 5 degrees, which means that you're starting to stress the physes a little bit too much. There was no change in the control group. Strength, there really wasn't a huge change either. So I think what have we learned, right, is so we know that those weighted ball programs are effective. They do increase velocity. However, when you start looking at it, what's the risk reward again, right? So if they kind of, help with that arm strength or not really. Do they really help with the arm speed, etc.? But if we're really kind of getting that increase in external rotation and total range in 6 weeks, that's a very fast time to gain that range of motion. And is it too much too quickly? Again, Wolff's laws. So yes, studies show external rotation correlates with throwing velocity. But here we are. If we're seeing the injury rates get climbing up and these players are gaining 10 degrees of external rotation using a weighted ball, we might be pushing them past their physiological limits, right, at too young of age. So is it kind of, is it that? Is it that we're pushing them too hard? Or is it that we aren't giving them rest and adequate time away from throwing? So those are the questions that are kind of always posed in the baseball world. But we do know this. You got 5 times more likelihood to get injured if you're pitching more than eight months per year. And this was been known for quite a while. And this goes back to 1980 or 2006. But we just don't really know what's the true dosage. And I think that depends kind of highly on the kid, right? But I think that's something that we need to be a little bit more conscious of. So what's the recommendation or what to do is, learn the proper mechanics. You can't have your primary thing of a velocity program. And you really shouldn't be throwing long toss and weighted balls with everybody. You got to be very careful with who you do that. Again, you can't have your cake and eat it too. So his whole performance enhancement program, I know Phil just finished this through Mike Reinold's performance. What do you call that thing, Phil?
Champion performance specialist.
There you go. Congratulations, Phil. So I don't know how specific it was for baseball, but so basically his whole thing for baseball is to reduce the stress, increase the efficiency, manage the stress with PT and the manual therapy, and maximize potential with the arm care, stability, strength conditioning, and integrating the whole chain. I think one of the things too that I know that has been kind of backed out a lot with some of the PT programs is, they know that exercise is really the big thing. But I think the emphasis, because the research isn't super solid on manual therapy, is not as emphasized. But I think manual therapy does have a key here in helping manage the stress on the shoulder. I would 100% agree with that. But I know that there's a lot of people that don't necessarily believe that. So, but yeah, so I thought this was really kind of the best explanation of how to kind of clump all this stuff together and how to understand what buckets we need to fill for each of these guys. It doesn't give you a perfect recipe for when you should do what, but you should have a pretty good idea of what you want to be able to do for them to help them minimize that injury and help kind of spread out the strengthening and stuff through the year. So cool. Awesome. Good times. What's in the chat? Oh, you upgraded Zoom, Phil. Thank you. You didn't?
I did.
Okay, cool. All right. So
cut through your share of knowledge, Ross.
My rambling. So no, I'm just I was interpreting information and I was pulling it off of memory from what I remember him talking about too. So EMG stuff. Any cool stuff that you guys found?
So I had a few articles and then Pam and Dexter sent me some of theirs as well. And there was actually some overlap. So that's kind of cool. But what I ended up doing was I created a Google Doc and I made this table where it lists the article, the exercises they looked at, and then what the results were in terms of EMG activation. So I'll share that with everyone in the email thread that Phil has for this drink thing.
Drink thing.
Yeah. So some of them are older just because they're like classics and they're like the one, like quote unquote classics, like the ones that were cited like multiple times at like the San Francisco Giants Sportsmed conference and then the ASMI course. But I think it's just because Mike and Kevin were there. So it's their research. But like their study. Yeah, all of them were there. So they cite their own research. But yeah, so there's one by Mike and Kevin from 2002 that just showed the EMG activation of infraspinatus and teres minor of different external rotation exercises, whether it was prone, standing, all that stuff. So that's in there. And then some of the newer stuff. One that was really interesting was this systematic review done in 2017. It was in JOSPT. But they did a systematic review of 20 articles of EMG studies, and what they ended up doing was pulling the data from those 20 articles, and he created these beautiful like bar charts of like each muscle group, all 4 rotator cuff muscles, and it goes from like lowest EMG activity to highest EMG activity. So what's neat is like you can see which exercises are like more feasible for someone early on, like post-op rotator cuff or what have you, where you don't want to activate as many of the muscles. And then like at the other end of the spectrum where you want to specifically target that muscle, these are your go-to, right, for highest EMG activity. So I thought that article was really cool. I have copies of all these articles. So if you guys want any of them, I can just let me know and I'll email them to you. Sorry, how do I share this right now? Is there a way to just show? Oh, I can share my screen, huh? Can I do that?
Yeah, press that green button.
Okay. I'm like so new to Zoom, guys. Whoa, what do I do? Okay, I think I choose this. Wait. Wait, how do you know which one to choose?
Just click on it.
But there's so many options.
Just click on, well,
the one that you want to share.
It should be like a bunch of windows.
Yeah. Okay.
Like if you want it, if your article is on the Google, oh, there we go.
Can you see it?
Ow!
Okay.
Dang.
Cool. Yeah. So this is the title. Yeah. So this Edwards one right here is the systematic review. So I kind of summarized some of them, like lowest and highest, but if you want the article, I can send it to you. That shows all the charts. This was the one that came out at the end of last year in International Journal of Sports PT with Masaki. Yeah, from San Jose State with Todd Ellenbecker, looking at scaption raises and standing versus quadruped versus prone, and at various weights, and what the EMG activity was for upper trap versus lower trap for all those.
Sexy. Just noticed that.
This third one is the research platform I went to. So there's no article on it. It's just the notes I took from the presentation, but it's an exercise we all use a lot. It's the band pull apart one, like this and like this and like this, right? So
Chase usually calls those like the cheerleaders, like
the cheerleaders.
Yeah, I don't know why you call them cheerleaders. It's just like this. Yeah.
Anyways, yeah. So they looked at, whether the hand position changed EMG activation and the direction, like dominant arm up or horizontal or down. And so they looked at EMG of supraspinatus, posterior delt, infraspinatus, teres minor, middle trap. They looked at everything. So that one was pretty cool. And then that's the Mike and Kevin one I mentioned earlier. They looked at all these exercises, and these are kind of the highlights of their study. The most.
Is that where they came up with the throwers 10? Is that the one?
I don't know. Maybe.
It might be.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I know it's the one.
10, or this is like or they were looking at throwers 10 exercises.
I think they got the throwers 10 out of that study. So, because originally the throwers 10 was kind of come up by a guy named Townsend. And then I think when they actually studied the EMGs, then they were like, yes, here's your top 10 exercises for a thrower. So
I know this is the one where it showed why the towel between the elbow and the body is important, because it increases external rotation activity. So so that was a big one from that one. And these are some other ones that like Pam and Dexter and I kind of found through the years. And some of them had some really weird exercises, so I tried to like put the pictures from the articles in there. Let's see. Yeah, so I'll share this with you guys. This one was a weird one, this 2008 Kibler one. There's some older school exercises, I feel like like lawnmower and robbery.
So like oversex.
That's like Russ Payne is famous for all these exercises.
Oh yeah, is that where these come from?
He always talks about the robber, the robber. It's like, oh, okay.
Yeah. So
we're talking like the sexiest exercise, are we looking at like highest EMG activity that's considered the sexiest, or are we looking at like visual aesthetic, like sexy?
I don't know. I think because I think we're talking sexy because typically
Like
a lot
what
of these
gets the people
exercises are pretty
going?
boring, right? Yeah. Like, what makes people go, oh, this is cool, right? How many times have you shown them external rotation and they go, oh, right? And
Yeah.
it's the same thing. It's like vanilla, right?
Yeah.
So we're looking for that chocolate sundae, with cookie crumbles on top and a cherry.
Well, I think it depends on your perspective. If you're nerds and like say, I love this, I think this exercise is sexy because look at all that EMG activity. Woo.
Yeah.
Right? But to patients, that's probably not as exciting.
Throw in some lawnmowers, make it sexy.
And then make
at least
them
get a
make
good-
the noise too. Vroom.
Oh man.
Yeah, good stuff.
Funny.
Anyways, so I'll share that with you guys and everyone in the group on the email thread. If you guys know of any other ones, feel free to add on to this. Like, it doesn't have to be like this is the ones, right? It could be a living document, like, and we keep kind of adding on stuff.
I like your title too. Sexy RC and stuff.
That's what I saw.
I was just going based off the outline for today's Think Before You Drink session.
Oh.
That's Ross. That's all Ross. Okay.
That reminds me of at TCC at the Westgate. Remember, there's that sexy show.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And so for that one year when I was there with Dan, every time we'd walk by the sign, I'd be like, sexy. He'd be like, dude, all right, you said it like 20 times already.
Oh, man.
Like every year there's like one thing you have on repeat at TCC. This year it was Shania. I love her.
Dude,
Shania.
dude, I love Shania all the time, dude.
Yeah, but that was like every billboard we saw.
Because she was up a lot. She was
They were promoting her
making a
residency.
comeback.
All right, let's get Paka going.
All
What you
right.
got, Paka?
Nothing really. Well, I thought Paulina was gonna come up too. Sorry, guys.
Oh, what are your thoughts so far?
On our athletic training aspect of this whole thing that we talked last time?
Yeah. Like, what are some on-field things?
Let me think. Well, definitely what I've been doing actually with not so much with swimming at SJSU, but with synchro, I just have them do trying to create like a warm-up that gets like the main muscle groups that they need for their practices. I've been teaching them that. It's basically just a dynamic warm-up. So I think if like an athletic trainer works with a team, it would be very beneficial. I mean, I don't know, it also depends on the strength and conditioning and the coaches, like what they think of it, but I think it would be really beneficial if we were included in their warm-up routine for games or practices as well, and we created one that is not only a warm-up but more of an injury prevention stuff as well, because I put in my warm-up, I put a lot of injury prevention stuff, just like rhythmic stabilization and like other like stuff for synchro as well. So I mean, I haven't thought of any special like stuff for different sports, but I know I do have one for synchro, and they seem to like it. And it's interesting because sometimes they don't do it on their own and they complain after their workout. So yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah. I think it's very important that athletic trainers should be included in those kind of stuff as well, not only strength and conditioning specialists, because they might not have not the knowledge but the experience and all the like injuries that could result.
Got it.
Yeah, I don't know
what are your
pollen
thoughts?
is.
Sorry, I had to find the unmute.
Oh. Yeah, what are your thoughts about?
No, I mean, again, I feel like I think I'm on the same boat as you, Philip. I haven't really put too much thought into baseball. Is not really a sport that I kind of kept up with. So I think this whole like 2-part series so far has been pretty eye-opening because I've never watched baseball before. That was just a sport that I just never grew up, being around at all. So a lot of this stuff is really, really new. And I know that when we did a brief like lecture or two on throwing mechanics in sports in my last orthopedic class in PT school, they did talk about a lot of this stuff, but it was super, super brief. So a lot of this stuff is pretty new to me. So it'd be interesting to kind of see how this, especially now that I'm starting to like kind of get back into patient care, how this stuff can kind of play into some of the people that I may or may not see over the next 8 weeks or 7 weeks. So
Right. Yeah, I think with anything, with any sort of facet in just like sports medicine, there's always like that extending branch that like all of us clinicians, like we don't necessarily know until we get into that situation. And then that's where we kind of just like flip the switch and feel like we're thrown into the fire per se, and just what do we do now, right? And it's good that we come together and just share these ideas and
100%.
and come up with a plan, that kind of thing. Nice background, Ross.
Shania.
Oh man. Shania came to think before you drink.
Yeah, she did. Isn't that funny?
Oh man.
Oh my god.
I gotta have fun, man. Gotta keep it light.
Yeah. All right.
Oh, good stuff.
Does anyone else have anything else to contribute? I think we went over a lot in a short amount of time for an hour, just to talk about a lot of different facets. I'm not sure, Ross, what's your thoughts on the next think before we drink topic?
Oh, let me see.
We had something on like knees, like the bee's knees kind of deal.
I think we had. Let me see. Let me look here. Yeah, there's a couple things we could kind of go over. We could do clinical reasoning,
That'd be a good one.
hamstring avulsions, or knee stuff.
I think
I vote clinical reasoning.
Yeah, we can do clinical reasoning. I like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, that works.
Cool. All right, so 2 weeks from now, we'll go over clinical reasoning. Just are we talking about more of like a what's that? Like an algorithm based approach, clinical reasoning, or just like anything?
Kind of like a mix between the the PowerPoint that we had and also some of the stuff from Rob's course. So I could have Jendo can kind of throw in her 2 cents on a lot of it too, and kind of add in a little bit more. So, but kind of going, we can even bring in. We'll tie it up with the PDF, the evaluation form too, Abdul.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah.
Awesome.
Cool. Well, thanks, Paco, Abdul, Jendo, and Ross.
No
This was
problem.
great.
Thank you.
We'll see everyone in 2 weeks. Hopefully, get some more participants, and think before we drink. Keep spreading the wealth of knowledge.
Oh, one thing I wanted to say real quick. Sorry.
Yes.
That article you're talking about, the YKB9.
Yeah.
I looked like closer at the intervention, and they only asked them to do those exercises at least once a week. So that wasn't even that frequent, and they got those results. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, I don't know. Like, maybe like, what if they did it more often and the injury rate goes down even more?
Even more.
Like,
Yeah.
that'd be a good like a redo of the study and just to see
Mm-hmm.
how that goes. But yeah, it's interesting because because I was asking all of my friends who are in the baseball world and just like what were their thoughts, but none of them really mentioned the YKB-9. Like they all kind of strayed towards like the throwers 10 and just like your basic strength and conditioning, especially with the youth population. But there wasn't any studies that have an injury prevention program related to injury rates. So I think it was good to see that there's something like the YKB-9 show those kind of stats. So, but yeah, it'd be cool to get more research out there and just seeing how it changes. But yeah, cool. All right.
Sweet.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you,
Yeah,
Phil.
thank you.
All right. See you guys
Party
next
on.
time.
All right. Have a good one.
Bye,
Bye.
guys.
Bye.